Dr. Elias Varn sat alone in the dimly lit observatory, the soft hum of servers and the occasional creak of the building's framework, his only companions. It was the kind of isolation he preferred, a solitude where his thoughts could stretch out like the stars. Tonight, though, the silence felt heavier, almost suffocating, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The signal came just past midnight. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint anomaly on the spectrograph, buried in layers of cosmic noise. Elias almost dismissed it as interference from one of the nearby pulsars, but something about the pattern stopped him. He leaned closer to the monitor, the glow highlighting the deep creases on his face, and adjusted the settings on the spectral analyzer. The pattern was unnatural. It wasn't just the frequency, a low, oscillating pulse that seemed to tug at the edges of his consciousness. It was the rhythm. It didn't match any known astrophysical phenomenon, no pulsar, quasar, or black hole signature. It felt deliberate, as if it were speaking a language just beyond human comprehension. And then, as he fine-tuned the receiver, the sound began to take shape in his headphones, a throbbing, alien hum, layered with faint, almost melodic undertones. Elias's heart raced. He hadn't felt this kind of exhilaration in years. He ran the signal through every available filter, mapping its frequency and decoding its intervals. As the hours slipped by, a pattern emerged, a series of coordinates embedded like a puzzle in the pulsating waves. "Coordinates?" he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from disuse. His fingers danced over the keyboard, cross-referencing the location. What he found made his blood run cold. The coordinates pointed to a location deep within the Arachnid Nebula, a region so remote and chaotic that even the most advanced probes struggled to navigate its gravitational distortions. It was an area of space known for inexplicable anomalies, ships that disappeared without a trace, strange energy readings that defied explanation, and whispers of ancient alien ruins. It had been nicknamed the Crimson Graveyard by the few explorers who dared to enter and lived to tell the tale. The coordinates weren't the only thing troubling Elias. As he studied the signal, he noticed a peculiar effect. His nose began to bleed. Just a trickle at first, but then more insistent, staining the back of his hand as he wiped it away. He ignored it, driven by a growing sense of urgency, though a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this was no ordinary phenomenon. He didn't believe in myths, but the name Red Mercury surfaced in his memory, unbidden. It was a substance shrouded in conspiracy theories and pseudoscience, rumored to possess impossible properties, anti-gravitational effects, limitless energy, and even interdimensional capabilities. Most dismissed it as a hoax, but there were stories of scientists and explorers disappearing after claiming to have found traces of it. Could the signal be connected? Elias's thoughts turned to the journal he had inherited from his late mentor, Dr. Henrik Lorne, a brilliant but controversial scientist who had spent the last years of his life chasing the Red Mercury legend. The journal was filled with cryptic entries, many referencing coordinates, ancient symbols, and a substance that transcends the periodic table. One of the entries came back to him now with chilling clarity. They called it a key, but it's a weapon. Its origins are not terrestrial, nor is it inert. The substance lives, grows. It chooses its host, and once chosen, it cannot be undone. Elias shuddered and rubbed the bridge of his nose, smearing dried blood. He had dismissed Lorne's ramblings as the ravings of a man who had spent too long chasing phantoms. But now, staring at the pulsating signal and its alien cadence, he wasn't so sure. The thought of assembling a team crossed his mind. He couldn't do this alone. But who would believe him? He barely believed it himself. Yet the signal's pull was undeniable, a lure as ancient as curiosity itself. His instincts, honed through years of studying the cosmos, told him this was bigger than anything humanity had encountered before. The question was whether it would lead to discovery or destruction. He pushed himself back from the console and stood, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. Through the observatory's wide, reinforced window, the night sky stretched infinitely above, a sea of stars shimmering with cold indifference. Somewhere out there, in the vast, unknowable void, lay the source of the signal, and it was waiting for him. The hum in his headphones seemed louder now, almost intimate, like a whisper in his ear. It sent a shiver down his spine as he turned back to the console and began drafting an encrypted message to a handful of trusted colleagues. If they thought he was insane, so be it. He'd leave in the morning to gather resources, charter a ship, and begin preparations. Elias didn't know what he'd find in the Arachnid Nebula, but deep down he already knew the truth. The universe, vast and empty as it seemed, was far from silent, and whatever was speaking to him now was older than humanity, older perhaps than Earth itself. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, Elias sat in the observatory, staring at the coordinates burned into the screen, the hum still echoing in his ears. His veins felt colder than they should, his mind heavy with unanswerable questions. The journey had already begun. The Aetheris cut through the fabric of space like a blade, its hull shimmering against the black void as it left behind the safety of known star routes. Elias Varn stood at the observation deck, watching the stars blur into streaks of light as the ship accelerated through hyperspace. Behind him, the hum of machinery and the occasional murmur of voices reminded him that he wasn't alone, though the weight of responsibility made him feel otherwise. The crew had been hard to assemble, convincing a linguist, a xenobiologist, an engineer, and a financier to follow a half-formed theory into one of the most dangerous regions of space had taken every ounce of his reputation, and more than a little deceit. Now they were all here, united by a fragile mix of curiosity, skepticism, and desperation. "Dr. Vaughn," a voice called from the doorway. It was Captain Reese, a weathered spacefarer with a sharp gaze and a reputation for navigating the most treacherous corners of the galaxy. "We're nearing the edge of the nebula. Thought you'd want to be on the bridge." Elias nodded, his throat dry. He followed Reese down the narrow corridor, the walls lined with exposed piping and conduits. The Aetheris wasn't a luxury vessel. It was built for endurance and adaptability. The hum of the engines vibrated through the floor, a constant reminder of how fragile their journey was. When Elias stepped onto the bridge, the view ahead stole his breath. The Arachnid Nebula loomed before them, a chaotic swirl of crimson and violet clouds, lit from within by bursts of electromagnetic storms. It looked alive, as if the nebula itself were writhing in slow, undulating movements. The beauty of it was undeniable, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way it seemed to pulse, almost in time with the signal still whispering through the ship's sensors. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Carter, the engineer, a wiry man with a perpetual scowl. "We're not even inside yet, and my instruments are already going haywire." "What kind of interference?" Elias asked, leaning over Carter's console. "Magnetic anomalies, gravitational distortions, stuff that shouldn't be happening this far out," Carter replied. "If I didn't know better, I'd say the whole nebula is unstable." Elias didn't respond. He already knew that the closer they got to the signal, the stranger things would become. He could feel it in his bones, a deep thrumming sensation that seemed to echo from within his chest. It wasn't just the ship being pulled toward the nebula. It was him. As the Aetherus entered the nebula, the ship's lights dimmed momentarily, flickering as if the nebula were reaching into the vessel itself. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but Reese's steady voice cut through the tension. "Keep calm, people. This is why we brought redundancies. Carter, stabilize the power grid. Dr. Varn, anything unusual with the signal?" Elias checked his monitor. The signal had grown stronger, but it was more than just an increase in volume. The pulse was no longer just a sound. It seemed to vibrate through the ship's metal frame, a low-frequency hum that was almost tactile. His fingers tingled as he typed, the sensation traveling up his arms. "It's changing," Elias said finally. "The frequency is modulating, almost as if it's responding to our presence." "Responding?" Kira, the linguist, leaned over her station. She had been deciphering the mathematical structure of the signal since they left orbit. "You think it's intelligent?" "Not necessarily," Elias replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "But it's definitely deliberate." As the Aetherus delved deeper, the anomalies intensified. Panels along the walls vibrated, and faint, unidentifiable whispers began to echo through the corridors. At first, the crew dismissed them as mechanical glitches, echoes of the ship's engines or interference from the nebula. But as the whispers grew louder, taking on the cadence of human speech, fear began to set in. The first incident occurred on the third day. Lieutenant Anders, a junior member of the engineering team, reported strange discolorations on his skin, fine, branching veins that glowed faintly red under the dim lights of the ship. By the time Elias examined him, the veins had spread across Anders's forearm, pulsing in time with the signal. "It doesn't hurt," Anders said, though his voice was shaky. "But it's spreading." Carter cursed under his breath. "This is exactly why I told you we shouldn't come here. Now we've got... what? Space leprosy." Elias ignored the outburst, focusing on the patterns beneath Anders's skin. The veins didn't look biological. They resembled liquid metal, coursing through his body as if his blood had been replaced by something alien. A memory surfaced, unbidden from Dr. Lorne's journal. "The substance grows, but it is not inert. It seeks connection." "We'll isolate him," Elias said. "Kira, help me set up a containment field in Medbay." Anders protested, but the others backed Elias. As they escorted the infected crew member out, Elias couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this was only the beginning. By the fifth day, the tension aboard the Aetherus was palpable. Anders' condition worsened. His veins had spread to his chest and neck, and his skin had taken on a faint crimson hue. He began muttering to himself, his voice a low, guttural rasp. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew started experiencing symptoms. Nosebleeds, headaches, and an oppressive sense of being watched. "It's this damned signal," Reese growled during a tense meeting in the galley. "It's doing something to us." "It's not just the signal," Kira added, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else. I've been analyzing the artifacts we picked up near the nebula's edge. They're resonating with the same frequency, like they're alive. Alive? Carter's voice was incredulous, but there was fear behind his bravado. Artifacts don't just come to life. They do if they're connected to whatever's out there, Kira shot back, her eyes narrowing. This isn't just some random signal, it's a call. And we answered. The room fell silent. Everyone was thinking the same thing, but didn't want to say it aloud. They were no longer just explorers. They were intruders. By the seventh day, the nebula seemed to close in around the ship. The clouds of crimson and violet thickened, swallowing the stars. Electrical storms erupted around them, bolts of alien energy dancing across the Atheris's hull. The ship's systems began to fail one by one. Navigation, life support, even gravity flickered intermittently. Then came the sounds, distant guttural roars that reverberated through the ship's structure. At first, they thought it was the nebula itself, but as the roars grew closer, more distinct, the truth became undeniable. Something was out there, and it was hunting them. Elias stood at the viewport, staring into the swirling chaos, his breath fogging the glass. The signal was louder now, deafening in its intensity. It felt like a heartbeat, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the crimson veins spreading beneath his own skin. "We've come too far to turn back," he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The journey into the unknown had already claimed them, and whatever awaited at the signal source was far worse than they could imagine. The Aetheris landed on a barren expanse of crimson rock, its landing struts hissing against the uneven surface. The planet's atmosphere was thin, breathable only with their pressurized suits, and the sky churned with roiling clouds of red and black. Jagged cliffs loomed in every direction, their surfaces pocked with unnatural hexagonal patterns that seemed too symmetrical to be formed by chance. The landscape radiated a strange, almost oppressive heat, as if the ground itself was alive, pulsing with an energy they couldn't see but could feel in their bones. Elias led the way, his boots crunching over the brittle surface. Behind him, the remaining crew followed in tense silence, their breath rasping through the speakers of their helmets. Anders was gone now, transformed into something unrecognizable, and the weight of his absence lingered like a shadow. No one spoke of what they had done to him, the decision they had made to leave him behind on the ship, strapped down and writhing as the crimson veins overtook his body. The whispers that had started in the corridors had grown louder, almost conversational, their tones mocking and alien. Ahead, the coordinates guided them to the entrance of what could only be described as an ancient structure. Its form was neither natural nor entirely mechanical, a massive, sprawling complex of interwoven metal and organic material. The walls glistened as if slick with moisture, though none of them could see any liquid. Strange, fleshy growths pulsated along the edges, glowing faintly with the same sickly red light that had haunted them since the nebula. The doorway yawned open before them, a gaping maw lined with serrated edges that looked disturbingly biological. Kira hesitated at the threshold, her fingers twitching nervously against her rifle. This isn't a building," she whispered. "It's something else." Elias didn't respond. He couldn't. The signal was deafening now, a relentless rhythm that seemed to vibrate through his very cells. His thoughts were scattered, his focus drawn to the pulsing light emanating from within. It was calling to him, compelling him forward, promising answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. The interior was worse. The air was thick and humid, tasting faintly metallic through their suits. The walls breathed, an almost imperceptible expansion and contraction that sent shivers down their spines. Organic cables snaked along the floor, pulsating in time with the signal. Every step felt like an intrusion, the ground itself yielding slightly beneath their boots, as if it resented their presence. They moved deeper, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The corridors twisted and turned, narrowing and widening seemingly at random, as if the structure had no regard for geometry or logic. Strange symbols covered the walls, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly, their shapes impossible to fix in the mind. Carter stopped to inspect one, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. The moment his gloved fingers made contact, the symbol flared to life, emitting a sharp, piercing noise that made everyone stagger back. "What the hell was that?" Reese barked, her voice sharp with panic. Carter didn't answer. He stared at his hand, his breathing uneven. When he finally turned, the others recoiled. The crimson veins had spread to his face, spiderwebbing across his cheeks and forehead, his eyes glowing faintly red in the dim light. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice hollow. Then he collapsed. They didn't have time to grieve or even examine him. The sound of movement echoed through the corridor, wet, slithering sounds that grew louder with every passing second. Elias motioned for the others to move, his own heart pounding as they pressed forward, deeper into the labyrinth. The source of the signal was close. He could feel it. The chamber they entered was vast, a cavernous space that stretched far beyond the reach of their lights. In the center, bathed in an eerie, pulsating glow, was the red Mercury. It was no longer just a substance. It was alive. The entity was an amorphous mass, shifting and reshaping itself constantly, its surface a shimmering blend of liquid metal and organic tissue. Tendrils of the substance extended outward, connecting to the walls and floor, embedding themselves in the very fabric of the structure. And then it moved. The entity surged forward, its tendrils writhing like the limbs of a predator. It didn't attack immediately. It studied them, its form quivering as if tasting the air. Elias felt an overwhelming pressure in his mind, a presence pushing against his thoughts, probing them. It wasn't just alive, it was aware. Reese fired first, her rifle spitting blue plasma into the mass. The shots struck the entity, burning holes into its surface, but the damage closed almost instantly, the liquid metal flowing back into place. It retaliated with a speed that defied comprehension, a tendril lashing out and impaling Reese through her chest. The captain's scream cut off abruptly as the tendril lifted her into the air, her body convulsing as the crimson veins spread across her exposed skin. Within moments, her flesh began to change, twisting and elongating, her face stretching into something unrecognizable before the entity absorbed her entirely. "Run!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking with terror. They fled, but the entity was faster. Tendrils lashed out, slicing through the air, forcing them into a narrow side passage. Kira stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the ground. Elias turned to help her, but froze when he saw her eyes. They were glowing red, her pupils gone. She grinned, her teeth glinting unnaturally sharp in the dim light. "It's already here," she whispered, her voice distorted, before she lunged at him. Elias didn't remember running, only that he was suddenly alone, the others gone, dead, transformed or worse. The signal was deafening now, a relentless pulse that threatened to split his skull. His legs carried him forward, deeper into the structure, until he found himself in another chamber, a control room, or what passed for one. Alien symbols and organic controls lined the walls, and in the center, suspended above the floor, was the entity's core. It was smaller here, more concentrated, its form pulsating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. He understood now. The red Mercury wasn't just a weapon or a resource, it was a seed, a living organism designed to terraform and consume. The planet, the structure, even the nebula itself. It was all part of the entity, a vast, interconnected system that thrived on assimilation, and it wanted him to join it. Elias staggered forward, his body heavy, his vision blurring as the crimson veins spread beneath his skin. The entity's tendrils reached for him, and for a moment he considered letting them. The promise of connection, of understanding was intoxicating. But then he saw the faces of his crew, Reese, Carter, Kira, and something inside him snapped. He reached for the alien controls, his fingers trembling as he activated them blindly, trusting some instinct he couldn't explain. The chamber shook violently as the structure began to collapse, the entity roaring in a soundless psychic scream. As the tendrils closed in, Elias turned and ran, the walls collapsing around him. The last thing he saw before escaping was the entity's core, pulsing wildly, its glow dimming as the structure imploded. He emerged onto the surface, gasping for air, the crimson sky swirling above him. The Aetherus was gone, consumed by the collapsing structure. He was alone now, the signal finally silent, but the veins beneath his skin still glowed faintly red. And deep in his mind, he could still hear its whisper. The escape pod hurtled through the crimson sky, its thrusters straining against the gravity of the collapsing planet. Elias Varn slumped in the pilot's seat, his breathing ragged, his vision blurred. The veins beneath his skin glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with a heartbeat that wasn't entirely his own. His hands trembled as he gripped the controls, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing down on him like the gravity he was fighting to escape. Through the viewport, the planet twisted and cracked, its surface crumbling inward as the ancient alien structure collapsed into itself. Jagged pieces of the crust broke apart, falling into a churning vortex of light and darkness at the planet's core. It was beautiful in a way, a cosmic ballet of destruction. But Elias felt no awe, only terror. The entity wasn't dying, it was retreating, returning to whatever dormant state it had existed in before the signal awakened it. The realization struck him like a knife to the chest. He hadn't destroyed it. He had only delayed it. The pod cleared the atmosphere, the stars bursting into view as the red haze fell away behind him. Elias collapsed back into his seat, his breath hitching as adrenaline gave way to the crushing silence of space. The hum of the signal was gone, but in its absence there was a void, an aching emptiness that felt even worse. He was alive, but at what cost? He closed his eyes and tried to think of Earth, of the green fields and blue skies he hadn't seen in years. But even that memory was tainted now. The red Mercury, the entity, it wasn't bound to the planet he had left behind. It was inside him. He could feel it coursing through his veins, an invasive presence that wasn't just changing his body, but whispering to his mind. "You belong to us now," it seemed to say, its voice soft, almost tender. "You are the key, the harbinger." Elias opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. His reflection stared back at him in the pod's cracked glass, distorted and faintly illuminated by the crimson glow beneath his skin. His pupils were gone, replaced by glowing red orbs. He reached up to touch his face, his fingertips brushing against skin that felt too smooth, too warm, too alien. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm still me. I'm still human." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. The pod's navigation system beeped, jolting him from his thoughts. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the console. The autopilot had engaged, charting a course back to Earth, the only destination programmed into the pod's limited systems. He felt a wave of dread wash over him. Returning to Earth meant risking the contamination spreading, unleashing the red Mercury's influence on humanity. But what choice did he have? He was a dying man, his body betraying him with every passing moment. As the pod drifted through the void, the faint hum of the engines became a rhythmic pulse, too familiar to ignore. He sat up straighter, his heart pounding as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the engines, it was the signal. Again. Elias stared at the console, his hands shaking as he scanned for its source. It wasn't coming from the pod. It was coming from outside, from space itself. The coordinates burned onto the screen made his stomach drop. They weren't random. They pointed to Earth. It's already there. His breath caught in his throat. The entity had sent a signal ahead, spreading its call long before he had even landed on the planet. The red Mercury wasn't just inside him, it was waiting for him, calling to him, preparing for his arrival. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The thought was a dagger of despair. "No," he said again, louder this time, his voice echoing in the tiny cabin. "I won't let it happen." But even as he resolved to find a way to stop it, the whispers grew louder in his mind, filling the void with promises and threats. Images flashed before his eyes, Earth consumed by the red Mercury, its cities crumbling as organic tendrils spread across the landscape. People transformed, their bodies twisting into grotesque alien forms. And above it all, the entity, vast and pulsing, its tendrils extending across the stars. "Dr. Varn," a voice said, startling him. It wasn't the entity this time. It was the pod's emergency communication system, crackling with static as it connected to an orbiting relay station. "We're tracking your signal. You're approaching Earth airspace. Status report." Elias froze, his heart pounding. His hand hovered over the console, torn between responding and staying silent. He thought of the crew he had lost, of Reese's final scream and the look in Kira's glowing eyes before she attacked him. He thought of Anders, twisted and transformed into something inhuman. And then he thought of Earth, of the billions of lives that would be at risk if he brought the entity's influence back with him. The whispers in his mind grew louder, urging him to respond, to continue forward. He clenched his fists, fighting against the growing pull, but it was like resisting the tide. The red Mercury wasn't just in his veins, it was in his thoughts, his very soul. "Dr. Varn," the voice repeated, more urgent now. "Do you copy? Are you in distress?" He closed his eyes, his hand trembling over the console. The coordinates to Earth were locked in. The pod was on autopilot, and he didn't have the strength to override it. He was already infected, already compromised. There was no way to stop what was coming. Or was there? A flicker of resolve lit within him. His hand moved to the emergency controls, hesitating for only a moment before he input a manual override. The pod's systems screamed in protest, alarms blaring as he redirected its course away from Earth. It would be a one-way trip, sending him and the red Mercury into the heart of the nearest star. The whispers grew frantic now, their promises turning to threats, their soothing tones twisting into rage. Elias gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face as he fought against the entity's influence. "You won't have me," he spat through clenched teeth. "You won't have them." The alarms reached a deafening crescendo as the pod shifted course, the gravitational pull of the star drawing it in. The heat began to rise, the metal creaking and groaning around him. Elias slumped back in his seat, his body trembling as the crimson veins beneath his skin pulsed one final time. The entity's voice screamed in his mind, a sound of anger and fear, before it was silenced. As the pod hurtled toward the star, Elias felt a strange calm wash over him. He thought of his crew, of the lives he had failed to save, and the world he was about to protect. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The last thing he saw before the light consumed him was the distant blue-green glow of Earth, serene and untouched, for now. And then there was nothing.